Oh, here she is already.
All right.
Wonderful. Hi, Sabine.
Hello, how are you?
Hi, welcome to Busch Hall.
Thank you.
Uh, Thank you. Before we get started, I just have a few opening remarks. I just want to remind everyone that Busch Hall is our virtual space to reimagine art and identity through the lens of the Busch-Reisinger Museum, and that this conversation series is generously supported by our German friends of the Busch-Reisinger Museum, to which we are very grateful for all of their support. Also recently for our Busch Hall annual lecture, Busch-Reisinger Museum annual lecture, which was held here in person at the museum, and which will have a recording online live soon. That was a talk by Natasha A. Kelly. As we begin today's talk, the Harvard Art Museums acknowledge that Harvard University is located on the traditional and ancestral land of the Massachusetts, the original inhabitants of what is now known as Boston and Cambridge. We pay respect to the people of the Massachusetts tribe, past and present, and honor the land itself, which remains sacred to the Massachusetts people. So I'm thrilled today to be here in conversation with Sabine Eckmann. Sabine is William T. Kemper Director and Chief Curator at the Mildred Lane Kemper Museum at WashU in St. Louis, also one of my old stomping grounds. And so it's great to reconnect with Sabine via Instagram today. Sabine is a specialist in 20th and 21st century European art and visual culture, with particular focus on the intersection of art and politics, ranging from exile art and Cold War aesthetics to European post-unification art, which will be also largely the focus of our conversation today. And I'm just really thrilled to welcome you, Sabine. You are one of the leading specialists in German art, and of course your work has greatly influenced my own and many of my colleagues over the years, and so it's a real honor to have you here on Busch Hall.
Well, thanks so much for having me. It's nice to reconnect, Lynette.
I was thinking maybe we would start sort of with your most recent project at the Kemper, and then kind of work our way backwards towards the themes. You know, we chose for today's talk the title National, European, and Global, to describe questions around German contemporary art. But most recently, you were really digging into the work of one artist in particular, and that is Katharina Grosse. So I thought maybe we could start there, how you saw a project on Grosse as, you know, also a continuation of your decades-long engagement with German contemporary art.
Sure. Maybe to start with, here at Washington University, we commissioned in 2015 Katharina Grosse to do a huge painterly intervention, although she doesn't like that word, in our gym. And so she spent a lot of time here, and so we started talking about a possible exhibition about her studio paintings, because she's so really well known to all of us for her paintings over real sites, physical sites, be it the Hamburger Bahnhof or sites in the United States. I sort of was curious about her studio paintings, and I also was what made me really interested in the project is that it comes a little bit, or Katharina definitely has also the aspiration that her art matters in a socio-political way, that there is a social responsibility, and to connect that now to abstract painting, you know, where there is no reference anymore at all, I found that a challenge for myself. And so as I started being really interested to understanding her paintings. And there was obviously also that second part, as we all know, you know, the late 1980s were really defined in Germany by male painters. And so she sort of made her way as a female painter from the very beginning, using large scales and being surrounded by this discourse and by colleagues who were all male. And so that obviously, you know, also was a point of interest for me. So trying to bring these two things together, the historical moment, but also then that claim of, or that aspiration that total, you know, really uniquely abstract painting with no reference, with no indexical character, can also have a social political responsibility, in short.
Yeah, no, that's really great. And actually kind of leads me then into, you know, a lot of the work that I've been thinking about lately, and looking back to your project, which we mentioned in our advertisement for this talk back in 2007, when you were really for the first time looking at issues in post-wall German art, or issues around reunification and then recent art in Germany. And, you know, looking through that catalog again, I was struck by, you know, how much is photography, photo-based, video, film, installation. And actually one of my questions for you today was, you know, where is painting in this, especially because we still think, I think you mentioned the 1980s, right? But we still think, when we think of sort of German national identity in art, we still think about painting. I mean, it really, those moments in painting have really defined, you know, how we've thought about German art. So I'd be curious if you could expand actually not on Grosse and how she is doing that, but also more generally.
Well, as you know, for every exhibition we do, specifically when these projects are so broad, we always have to come up you know, with some kind of interpretive frame. And so I, you know, wanted at that time, and, you know, these exhibitions don't happen from today to tomorrow. So I started, you know, thinking about that already like in 2003 or something like that. And so I was first, you know, thinking I should limit that to a certain generation, just because otherwise it became too vast. So I really deliberately, if the artists appreciate that or not, but cut out an older generation. And with that, I also cut out some of the painters with which we associate basically really the 1980s into the 1990s. Would I do it the same way today again? I don't know. That would be, you know, maybe that would be a prelude or something like that. So that was one aspect. So Kiefer, I mean, the older generation like Baselitz, Lüpertz, Kiefer, they were certainly not in, but then also the, you know, somewhat younger generation, like Kippenberger or somebody like that, were also really not in. So I was really looking at a very young generation of artists, all born in the 1960s, you know. So that was one limitation, and that research really brought out a lot of positions that had not that much to do with this kind of painting, and was really more focused really on conceptual approaches. And then there, I try to, you know, create this link also between, you know, aesthetics on the one hand, and then this transformative moment in German history on the other hand. So that you have that title, Reality Bites. And then I was looking more and really sort of saw of how many of these artworks in one way or the other mediate new ways of how to deal and integrate the real in their works. And that sort of brought me back, to the historical avant-garde, not so much in terms of its military ascent, but more in terms of this combination of art and life. And so I went a little bit, you always want to ground your work in history and art history and discourses. And so these were these two combinations. And then there were definitely painters, but it was a different kind of painting in terms of like Michel Mayeros, for example, who today is very important. He was in the show, and he was in the show with several paintings, but it was a different approach to painting. It was not so much grounded in either the critique or an affirmation of German Expressionism, what you can find more in the late 1980s. Long answer to a short question.
No, that was great. And I think, coming back to Grosse, I mean, you mentioned, her also coming of age when, the field was dominated by male painters. I mean, the field sort of across the board, or at least certainly, the way that in the United States we've understood German art really after 1960 is still largely in terms of those painters. So maybe you can describe for our audience that might not be as familiar with Grosse, how do you see her kind of both coming of age in that moment of those traditions, but also finding her own way to address issues of reality issues, socio-political issues, because I do think it's not something, unless you've dug into some of the installations or some of the sites that she's chosen, that's quite as easy for viewers to grasp.
Yeah, definitely. And also for me, so that was why I was interested, and it was a challenge to figure that out. And we had many, many conversations about that, which really made the work, her work and her paintings for me so much richer. And so I think she does say that she sees her painting as providing alternative imaginations, alternative realities with which we can take and then turn into something very open-ended, but which are definitely, connected to our daily lives, to our social responsibility, to our being part of a community. And then I, look to the paintings, and there are some, very obvious things of where she is different from, for example, some of these male painters. We did actually do a catalog that's a reference book, and for the very first time, it's not only that we are reproducing, I think 160 or more of her paintings, but it's also for the very first time that we are reproducing her work in the studio. So there are a lot of studio photographs where you can see how she works and how she also reconfigured, artistic subjectivity. And her very first painting we're showing still looks like the 1980s male painters. And then all of a sudden there's, even, 2 years later, her painting has changed radically. And so one thing she really focused on is to sort of mess around with hierarchies in painting. So in all of her paintings, it really is a little bit about challenging what is above and what is below, and in which way you can actually see the ground of the painting on the surface, and vice versa, and how how colors really relate to each other. If you put blue on green, what do you really see then? And so that was, really fun. So once I understood that, I understood, okay, that's also her approach actually to painting. Then she never ever paints one painting at a time. It's really a performative approach to painting, and you can see that in this photograph in the book, that she always works on several, if not a ton of paintings at the same time, so that it's, a clear departure from the author of one work with studies that lead to that work, to really also engaging the body in the process of painting and going over the boundaries of the actual canvas. So another really important aspect of her paintings is that they're never straight boundaries. They're never straight lines in her paintings. So she's very much interested in that space that defines the border in between, so that there's an in between in this boundary between green and black, or between the canvas and the real world. And it led, she also invited other players onto the canvas, from soil, for example, to tree branches, to stencil, so that she lost control as the only and sole author of her paintings. So once you get into that, more and more of that becomes very obvious. Very recently, she also slashed her canvases so that the wall behind the canvas also is part of the artwork. And then most recently, she really also just painted on the floor and on the walls, and what is in the painting is almost like an end product. It's not, the focus is not anymore on the canvas, but it's on the entire wall, and then the canvas is lifted, so that you have a fragment of a larger painting. So you can see, the more you really focus on that, the more it becomes interesting and the deeper you go. But maybe that's maybe an experience from our visitors. They were also just very taken by this kind of physical presence of these works. There's an energy to them. They're very, very colorful. And I think Graham Barter called it there-ness of, this physical there-ness of painting. And in that way, it also establishes its own reality. So it's not anymore a painting with any kind of reference, or a painting which focuses, like all these male paintings, on subjectivity and individualism. It really becomes, this new reality that is on offer, and you can, as a visitor, as a viewer, do with that what you want. So it's
So if I were to press you and say then, because obviously from the perspective of the Busch-Reisinger Museum, my work in many ways is forced to deal with geographies, or maybe how the national relates then to the global. Does it matter to you that Katharina Grosse is a German artist? Is there anything for you where you would say, because that's kind of what I'm trying to tease out these days, because I feel like, we talked about this kind of German national aesthetic and these kind of stubborn notions we have about sort of Germanness writ large, but also in German art, sort of what defines it. And certain artists end up, being understood as, more global or European, and others still kind of within this notion of a sort of German national identity. And I'm just curious, does it, for you, especially because you're a specialist in German art, but also collect and have done many contemporary art projects with artists from all over the world, does it matter?
I do think that it still matters, and I do think that in one way or the other, she is also German, I would say, but not German in the maybe old way, you could say, but as when I conceived Reality Bites, it was really the unification of, that really was a major transformation in Germany. And I think today, Germany is a post-migratory country. That's also why these issues of global and European sort of matter. Katharina is very much also involved with that. She has a blog, we do this, wir machen das, where it is really also very much about conversations and engagements with many artists who migrated to Germany and giving them a space in Germany. So I think although her generation, and with that also my generation, we were really educated not to identify with Germany. So, there was like, you really did not want to be German. And I think there will never be, this kind of easiness of identifying with one's country as you find it in the United States. I think this will never happen in one way or the other in Germany. But I think there is a renewed engagement, of how to integrate, for example, all the migrants that came in 2015. So many artists but also people, obviously, from Syria. There were a lot of people from Africa coming, and now from Ukraine. So it for this little country in comparison to the United States, I think there is a massive influx of different cultures and different voices that also need visibility. So, and I think, I don't know, did you see this show last year in the summer? So that showed the, Bundeskunsthalle in Bonn about the new collection of the Bundesrepublik Deutschland, of the official German collection, and it was called. I thought it was interesting. It was called Identity Not Verified. So so it was sort of interesting of how they really were also interested in this kind of polyphonic image of Germany. And there were a lot of artists from Turkey, from Syria, from Africa, artists who recently arrived, artists who voluntarily stayed, and obviously also artists who were born in Germany. And so I think identity still plays a role, but maybe in a different way,
I agree, and I think, it was telling to me that, already in Reality Bites, you made a point of looking at transnationalism also as a way to say, okay, these artists who are not necessarily German citizens, but they may be living and working in Germany, or they may be recent citizens, that they are still, by addressing the issues of the fact that they are living or working in Germany, are a part of this, very importantly, a part of that conversation, and that is a counter then to these ideas that were being promoted at the time of what is that new German identity, which we've known because we've been able, in hindsight of 30 odd years, we've been able to see how that failed, right? How often those ideas of a new German identity, haven't played out also to the benefit of many Germans and those living and working in Germany. So it's interesting to sort of, hear you talk about it now, from this perspective, although already then you were, I think I was looking at it again, you said something like an apparently globalized, context, and it's like, there is obviously today, we don't need the apparent, then it was, you were really addressing something that was, in its early stages of, at least in art history, of our recognizing it in a way that maybe other disciplines had previously.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. And it was also the moment of globalization, until a catalog is published, it takes time, but around 2002, 2003, that was also the moment where artists, for the first time, I think, really in Germany, addressed globalization. And if anything, I would say maybe to a certain extent, actually German identity is almost more important today again. There were some topics, I'm thinking of, citizens of the former GDR and artists of the former GDR. And that was really one topic where it was really, again, about German identity. And at the time already, there were artworks that really articulated or tried to visualize this issue of assimilation, actually, of of the citizens of the GDR. And I think that still exists very much so. It's very much also about this forgetting of this disappeared country, which also was Germany.
Yeah.
And there's a lot still, I think, with artists from the GDR where they still feel as artists and as citizens as secondary. And that, I think, is also an aspect that is very important for consideration of German identity in the visual realm, but also beyond.
Yeah,
and it was in that Bonn exhibition, there were several of these works, which I found pretty interesting.
Yeah, and that's also been my aim in recent years also, because our collection was so Western, in all senses of the word. So, actually making those acquisitions, very, very thoughtfully, and in the upcoming exhibition next year on art and identity to actually, so the ideas will start a little earlier, sort of, already in the 80s, to also help our viewers sort of lay the groundwork for, the identity question more broadly. But it's, it is really, going back to your project or some of these earlier attempts to actually, and also I have to say, you don't focus just on Berlin, which is also refreshing, because so much still, right, is this sort of focus on Berlin. So that, that is also, I think, an important thing to remember, that Germany, you said it, it was small, but it's not that small.
Right. Well, in comparison to the United States, it certainly is. There's no question. There's no question about it. Otherwise, yes, it's not that small. And I do think there's actually a lot of exciting and very political work done by a very global artistic community in the former East, in particular in cities like Leipzig or Dresden. So there, it's on the one hand East German artists, but there are also a lot of artists from really very different continents that practice there and do very interesting political work in terms of, I think, connecting their identity as non-Germans. A lot of artists, or some artists I know also from Africa, to actually this phenomenon of the feeling to be a secondary citizen of people from the former GDR. So that's interesting too, of how these histories actually get connected to each other. So it's a little bit like this layering of history, which is so important in Germany, and you always have to dig and excavate something. And so in the way, the Third Reich was connected to the terrorist movement in the 70s, we had some of those works actually in the exhibition in Reality Bites. So now you can almost follow that, from that phenomenon of being conceive yourself as a secondary German citizen, to those who are migrants to Germany, and connect to that history again. So there's I think there's a lot of interesting stuff still to be written on, and I'm really looking forward to your exhibition and catalog, and I'm sure I will learn a lot, about that. I mean, one last thing, which I don't know if you want to bring it up or not, but what I find also interesting, and it does show some kind of continuity, and it does show, I think, also some kind of uneasiness with German national identity in the arts, is that now we have a lot of artists actually. I just saw a show by Cameron Rowland at the Museum for Modern Art in Frankfurt that deal with these to be addressed aspects of German history, like colonialism, for
Yeah.
example. Or I met another African artist who did a really interesting video work on the Namibia and Herero genocide. So that there's also this invitation, you know, as we did, it was done earlier, like when, you know, when Germany really had to reckon with the Holocaust, they invited also for the big memorial in Berlin, Jewish artists and Jewish architects to deal with this history. And so it feels almost similar, you know, that right now you have artists from, you know, artists of color addressing colonialism and addressing, for example, that first genocide.
That's right, yeah. No, it's true, and it's exciting to see it happening. I mean, especially, you know, the MMK in Frankfurt has been at the forefront of so much of that work. But yeah, it is, and I think that's also, you know, one of the, you know, it's in some ways, you know, remember one of your themes was collective trauma, and you just mentioned obviously, you know, Germany's fascist past, but also the terrorism of the 70s. But you know, we know now, of course, you know, with all of the work that's been done on the country's colonial history, right, that we're, you know, there isn't just one, just like there isn't one historical marker that defines German identity, there isn't one trauma either.
Yes.
And yeah, I think that's actually, it's you know, we've been talking for a half an hour. I could keep going
I know.
forever. It's so fantastic to get your perspective, and you know, maybe we have to revisit, you know, when the show is up, and
definitely
have another chat. But this has been so incredibly helpful, and yeah, thank you, Sabine, and thank you for all of your incredible work.
Well, thank you for inviting me, because I think also once you enter a conversation, so many other things become clear in that conversation, and also push the, you know, discourse forward. So thanks for having me, and I'm really, really very excited about your show. So hope we can continue that conversation one way or the other.
Great, thanks
for inviting
so
me.
much. So take care, Sabine, and this recording will go up as soon as we're done here, and we will be adding captioning as soon as we can. So stay tuned for that, and for our conversation next month. We're hoping that we will be speaking with the artist Sung Thieu, who is actually opening an exhibition here in Cambridge at the List next Monday. And yeah, lots going on. And again, many thanks, Sabine, for joining us here on Busch Hall.
Well, again, many thanks for having me. Thanks, Lynette. Bye-bye.